That's what to do. Now, most gardeners have likely given some serious thought as to the type, the texture, even the pH of the soil beneath their wellies. What's less likely, though, is wondering about how the soil got there in the first place. It's a fascinating tale that Chris unravelled earlier today.
I've stepped outside to the Geological Walk, a fairly monumental collection of stones which really highlight the history of the stones beneath our feet. This tells a much greater story here at the British Geological Survey, and that's that rock gives us soil. And of course, all gardeners need soil. And there's three gents here who know more about soil than, well, you care to dig up in your garden. Dr. Barry Rawlins, Dr. Andy Tye and Dr. David Robinson. Now, gents, how do you explain the way in which the rock, such as the one I'm leaning against here, a great big sort of several tons of stone, how does that break down? What are the physical and biological processes involved in that?
Okay, well, there's a combination of mechanical processes, physical processes, chemical and biological processes. So, for example, one of your mechanical processes might be freezing and thawing, or thermal activity, which forces the rock fragments, the minerals, apart. You've got chemical weathering processes where acidic components weather the soil and break it down. And you've also recently, soil scientists have shown that even fungi, some of the biological components in the soil, can accelerate the weathering of the rock fragments and remove elements from it, and that way breaking it down.
Now, what's interesting is that we're talking about mineral particles, but by themselves mineral particles don't really constitute soil, at least not soil that we'd want to grow anything in. There's another essential ingredient, of course, organic matter. So how does organic matter find its way into the soil primarily, and how does it affect the way the soil behaves?
Okay, well, there are really five factors of soil formation, and they're referred to as CLORPed. So if I go through them briefly, you've got climate, Cl for climate, O for organisms, R for relief, that's the topography of the ground, P for parent material, which we've already talked about in terms of the rocks and the superficial material, and then there's time. And that's the time for the weathering to break down the rock into mineral particles. But the point you made was regarding the organic matter. So you've got your organisms, a combination of both flora and fauna, acting and growing. So you have your plant forming and growing, and then as that plant, parts of it die and decay, the shoots and the roots enter the soil as organic matter, and you've got organisms which then utilise that organic matter, and there's this what we refer to as organic matter turnover of the soil. So you have a pool of organic carbon, organic matter in the soil, and the biology interacts with that pool, and you essentially have a whole web of interactions between the plants, the organic matter in the soil.
And those plants are tremendously important in terms of the soil development, because what they are doing through their root systems is pumping carbon through exudates into the soil. That carbon forms essentially a food source for the microbial population, and it can really stimulate the microbial population in the soil, which is essentially the biogeochemical engine transforming nutrients, transforming rocks into nutrients, and making nutrients available again for plant uptake.
One of the things that is particularly striking in the building behind me here is the map on the wall, the geological map on the wall of the UK. Is it possible to encapsulate our geology into some sort of description of how the rocks are laid across the UK, and as a consequence, how the soils above them may also be responding?
Yes, it is. In the UK, we have a tremendous array of rocks dating from Precambrian out to the last glaciation for Holocene. Generally, it runs in a west to east direction with age, the oldest rocks being in the west. In the west, we've got most of the hard rocks in the UK, up in Scotland and down through Cumbria and down to Cornwall. And as we move east, we get to East Anglia and the southeast of England. We have the chalk from the Cretaceous times, and then East Anglia has a lot of Pleistocene-aged glacial deposits, which are very, very soft.
So in terms of the age spread of the rocks that are dotted across the UK, What sort of time range are we talking about?
So the oldest rocks, we're talking Precambrian rocks more than 560 million years old, and coming across, that's in the furthest to the west we talked about, and over to the east we're talking less than 500,000 years old. So a massive range in terms of time.
And what about the soil that sits on top of those rocks? How old is that likely to be?
Well, we've got, obviously, the fact that we had glacial activity occurring recently means that the soils in the UK are generally younger than other parts of the world. So, for example, if you went to tropical regions, you might find that the soils have been weathered for millions of years, whereas in the UK, we would generally consider that most of the soils are formed within the last 500,000 years, and possibly some even as young as 10 or 20,000 years old, based on the period of the last glaciation.
Life itself is dependent on the soil, and if you look back through history, the very rise and fall of civilization itself has been determined by the management of this resource.
Chris Beardshaw talking to doctors Barry Rawlins, Andy Tye and David Robinson. OK, who's got